Have you ever heard of an event where 800,000 people were killed in 100 days? Yes, you heard correctly. In just 3 months, one of the fastest and bloodiest genocides in history took place. People were slaughtered based on a single line on their identity cards. Neighbors killed neighbors. Streets were covered with corpses. Rivers ran red with blood. This was the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So how did such a massive slaughter occur in a small African country in just 100 days? What traumas did the survivors have to face after the genocide? How did it leave deep scars on society, the economy, and future generations? Let's turn the page on this dark chapter of history together and try to understand this story that must not be forgotten. Rwanda, a small country located in the heart of the African continent, so small that it could easily be overlooked on a map. Yet this tiny piece of land witnessed one of the darkest tragedies of the 20th century. So how could such a painful event have happened? To understand the answer, we must first look at the country's geography, social structure, and economic realities. Because no tragedy erupts overnight, it grows silently, fueled by years of accumulated problems. Rwanda is a landlocked country in the Great Lakes region of East Africa. It is sandwiched between Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Its mountainous terrain and high altitude have earned it the name, the Land of 1,000 Hills. While this geography makes the soil fertile, it has also made the country completely dependent on agriculture. The vast majority of the population makes a living from agriculture. However, as the population grew rapidly, the land became insufficient. As the land divided among families became smaller and smaller, it fueled poverty and social unrest. Even the fertile land was no longer enough to feed the people living on it. The majority of the population lives in rural areas. Agriculture is the primary economic activity. Production is mostly for self-sufficiency. There are export products such as coffee and tea, of course, but this income generally reaches only a small segment of society. The vast majority of the population lives in poverty. Job opportunities are limited, and social problems are increasing day by day. The Rwandan people consist of 3 main groups: the majority Hutus, the minority Tutsis, and a small community of Twas. They have lived together for centuries, but their economic roles have differed. The Tutsis have traditionally been involved in animal husbandry and have been considered more affluent, while the Hutus have mostly made a living from farming. Over time, these differences evolved into a social hierarchy and deepened the us versus them divide. At the beginning of the 20th century, Rwanda came under Belgian colonial rule, and this distinction was deliberately deepened. The Belgians granted privileges to the Tutsis to facilitate administration. They promoted them in education, administration, and government positions. The Hutus, on the other hand, were systematically marginalized. The seeds of hatred that would last for years were sown in this way. Worse still, people's ethnic origins began to be written on their identity cards. This practice would turn into lists in the genocide that would occur in the future. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, power fell into the hands of the Hutu majority. However, this time the roles were reversed. The Tutsis were marginalized, subjected to violence, and tens of thousands were forced to flee to neighboring countries. The anger that had built up during the colonial period was now returning as revenge. From a socioeconomic perspective, by the end of the 20th century, Rwanda was on the brink of a deep abyss. On one side was a small, educated segment that was relatively better off. On the other was a large majority struggling with land scarcity and unemployment. No matter how fertile the geography was, the rapidly growing population had negated this advantage. Agriculture could no longer meet the needs, and social unrest was growing day by day. All these factors, combined with the incitement of the political authorities, became a bomb ready to explode. Instead of solving the problems, the rulers chose to use ethnic differences as a political bargaining chip. Economic hardship, geographical constraints, and historical divisions converged, paving the way for a great catastrophe. Over time, armed groups emerged among the refugees. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, founded in 1987, consisted largely of exiled Tutsis. Their goal was to return to Rwanda and gain political representation. In 1990, these forces entered Rwanda from Uganda, sparking the Civil War. Fears and hostilities that already existed within the country were intensified. The Hutu-led government began to use this threat to its advantage. Tutsis were declared enemies through propaganda. Radio broadcasts used inhumane terms such as inyenzi, cockroach, to refer to Tutsis, poisoning the public with hate speech for days and months on end. Thus, even ordinary people began to see their neighbors as a potential threat. In 1993, international pressure led to the signing of the Arusha Accords. This agreement aimed to initiate a peace process between the RPF and the government. However, for Hutu extremists, this agreement was a betrayal. For them, sharing power with the Tutsis was unacceptable. It was at this point that the violence became unstoppable. By the 1990s, Rwanda was besieged by pressures both from within and without, and tensions had reached a peak in every segment of society. The people were unemployed, hopeless, and angry. All that was needed was a spark to ignite that anger. On the night of April 6, 1994, the plane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down near Kigali. Who shot down the plane remains controversial, but this question no longer mattered, because this incident provided the excuse needed for the genocide to begin. Hours after the crash, Hutu militias sprang into action across the country. Years of propaganda, hate speech, and social anger were now turning into real violence. One of the fastest and most brutal genocides in modern history had begun. For the next 100 days, life in Rwanda turned into a literal hell. Hutu extremist militias were organized under the name Interahamwe, those who attack together. Most of the time, they only had machetes, spears, or sticks in their hands. But the goal was clear: to systematically eliminate the Tutsi population. The propaganda machine, particularly the Mille Collines and RTLM radio stations, became the main engine of the genocide. Broadcasts announced the names of individuals to be killed one by one, calling on the public to do your duty, clean up the Inyenzi. Radio hosts read death lists accompanied by music, as if at a party. At this point, a painful truth must be acknowledged. The genocide was a tragedy involving not only armed militias, but also ordinary people. Neighbors who had lived in the same neighborhood for years denounced each other. Young people joined the militias and became part of the violence. Sometimes a Tutsi hiding in a house was found because a neighbor reported them. People were not safe even in places they thought they could seek refuge. Thousands of people who sought refuge in schools, churches, and hospitals were massacred en masse. 5,000 people were killed in Intarama Church, 20,000 in Nyarubuye Church. Places considered sacred were turned into graveyards. In some cases, people were burned alive. The Rwandan genocide was not merely a local tragedy. The calculations of global powers, political games, and the deep indifference of the international community made this catastrophe possible. France provided years of military training and arms support to the Habyarimana government to maintain its influence in Francophone Africa. Some members of the Hutu militias were trained by French military advisors. The 1994 Operation Turquoise humanitarian intervention actually facilitated the escape of the perpetrators of the genocide to Congo. The calls for help from General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN force, were consistently ignored. Worse still, UN forces were reduced to 2,500 while the genocide was ongoing. The UN avoided using the word genocide because it legally required intervention. After the losses in Somalia in 1993, the Clinton administration was extremely reluctant to send troops to Africa. The State Department covered up the truth by using absurd phrases such as genocide-like actions. Clinton later said it was my greatest regret, but it was too late. Rwanda had no oil, precious minerals, or critical geopolitical location. Therefore, intervention was deemed costly. Not intervening cost the lives of 800,000 people. Belgium also withdrew all its forces after 10 of its soldiers were killed, creating a domino effect. The Rwandan genocide painfully demonstrated how hollow the post-World War II promise of never again truly was. When the genocide ended, Rwanda had to face not only physical destruction, but also deep social wounds. The sense of trust had been completely shattered. The person who shared bread with you yesterday could have tried to kill you today. Hundreds of thousands of children were orphaned. Women had to live with the scars of systematic rape and violence. Many were infected with HIV and left to face social stigma. The country's economy collapsed, and 2 million people fled to neighboring countries. Most of the survivors suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. The killer and the victim had to live on the same street. How could they live together? How could justice be served? In 1994, the United Nations established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. However, it was impossible to try hundreds of thousands of people. Therefore, Rwanda established traditional Gacaca courts. These community-based courts sought to deliver justice at the local level in villages and neighborhoods. Rwanda chose a radical path with the slogan, "One people, one nation." The official recognition of ethnic identities was banned. Everyone was now simply Rwandan. Every year in April, the country observed a week of mourning, remembering but learning to forgive. Walking this fine line was not easy. Some Hutu families risked their lives to hide Tutsis. Some of the survivors chose to forgive. This was not forgetting. It was a painful decision made to break the cycle of hatred.